Hi everyone, and welcome to the 21st episode of your online tarot course series. In this episode, we're taking a look at the symbolism and interpretations behind the tarot card bearing the number 20, the Judgment. Now, just like the Temperance card, this one is also very controversial. The main symbolism and even the astrological correspondent of this card is not really set in stone. Some readers choose to follow its more classic interpretation. Other readers choose to follow the more modern one, while others simply have an extremely personal and individualistic take on this card. For example, certain decks don't even refer to it as judgment, for the simple reason that the term judgment doesn't really reflect what the author actually intends to symbolize through this card. So for example, the Crawley deck name it Eon, because rather than a judgment, it tries to highlight the fact that all judgment, regardless if it's personal judgment or in any way we try to understand this term, is also a perception and a perspective. So very many times it just comes from within and it is always subjective, including divine judgment, because if the divine is actually alive within us, it is actually the self who passes on the judgment or is the ultimate judge of our lives and destinies. The numerology behind this card, so 20 is 2, also speaks about duality, but in the sense that as within, so without. So basically our lives, our everyday reality, our normality, everything within our existence is a reflection of inner forces, inner configuration, our inner psychological patterns and tendencies. But at the same time, that which is within us is also a reflection of the divine patterns, of the divine architecture, for example, a soul contract. So within and without, above and below, both need to have a meeting point, and that is exactly our perception, that is our, symbolically speaking, judgment. It can also highlight that this card has so much to do with divine timing as well, because our inner clocks, let's say, tick simultaneously to the divine clock, and when the two timings meet and synchronize, then is the moment when, fate unfolds itself, when big important changes or whatever happen in our lives, those are fated moments. Or another way of seeing this is, even if, outer reality, the divine time is set for something to take place in our lives, it still cannot happen until we open up to it, until we can perceive it as the time is here. As in, until we have that inner wake-up call that finally it is ideal and also divinely orchestrated for something to happen in our lives, for us to, for example, step into a new cycle or to abandon an old cycle, etc. And last but not least, this is also a card which depicts karma. Every action has a reaction. Every single gesture of our thought, action, choice creates ripples, and it is those ripples that cause quantum entanglements. And the multitude of quantum entanglements are basically our lives, how they play out, our opportunities, our chances, everything that happens to us. So now that we understand what the main symbolism of this card tries to depict, first of all, let's take a look at its most classic, perhaps the original way of interpretation. Now, if we look at the card in very many classic decks, including the Rider White, The image shows the scene of the final judgment, of rapture, of resurrection. So it depicts all of this in a very biblical nuance, where naturally within fate, within destiny, within everything that happens here down on earth, there is a divine plan, a divine scheme behind it, and the execution of that divine scheme, of that divine programming, is basically us navigating through our destinies, our path, our lives. And as we navigate through it, naturally we evolve, things change, old challenges, blockages, limitations are overcome, and new ones take their place. Just as virtues become stronger and stronger with life experience, with skill, with us always trying to embodying these virtues the best that we can, and also we always embody them in our own individual and unique ways. And this is the imprint we leave on the divine schemes, on the divine patterns, because nothing is truly set in stone. All of us can execute our fates, our destinies, our life path, the way we feel, think, and believe it's best for us, or the way we think it resonates the most with our guiding principles, fate, etc. But of course, from time to time, or at least at the moment when we leave this earthly plane, we have to take everything into consideration that happened to us in this life, when we have to behold our actions, our choices, how we overcame our trials and tribulations, how well we managed to embody our virtues, for example. And whenever this happens, that is a moment of judgment. And it is exactly during these moments in life when we make extremely important life-changing choices, exactly because we have the perspective that we need, the perceptions that we need of how we managed to do things until this present moment, so we can tell right from wrong, even if this is extremely subjective, but we still embody the energy of judgment. This is where we are our own judges, taking a look at our lives and everything in it, and we make the choice, the judgment basically. What is it that we need to keep? What is it that we need to eliminate? How do we need to change and evolve further? And very many times the simple knowledge of what is it that we do not want, who it is, who we do not want to become, and the kind of life which we do not want to experience and live because it doesn't resonate with us, is already a massive step forward, even if we don't have all the answers, even if we don't genuinely know what we desire yet. But knowing what we do not desire is already a massive step forward, because we can seek whatever it is that we desire, even if that means a lot of experimentation and trying out new things. So usually this judgment card represents an inner wake-up call when the divine calls us to embrace a higher octave of something in our lives, or when actually it invites us to abandon something which no longer is reflective of who it is that we are and who it is that we are becoming. But as I said, this involves a massive epiphany. This involves a widening of our perspectives, and this involves perceiving life and reality in an upgraded or in a different way that we were used to. So in a classic exception of the judgment card, the emphasis is placed on the communication of the divine intelligence with us, with the divine within. So basically the biblical version of the final judgment, the biblical interpretation of the rupture, happens to all of us at certain points in our lives. Usually moments of crisis or moments when we have to make very important, big, impactful choices and decisions. When we feel that we are ready for our lives to take a different turn, but before this happens, naturally we have to face the past, we have to close old chapters, we have to disconnect from certain people, we have to learn how to, navigate through life in a different way, with a different philosophy, with a different life view, with different inner values. And at every such moment, symbolically, a part of our egos, a part of our identities, a part of ourselves dies and is reborn. It is resurrected, basically. Our souls are somehow refreshed so that we can start the new cycle, the new chapter, the new way of doing things, etc. In astrology, such an energy and such a moment is always depicted by the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. Whenever these two planets meet every 20 years, they open up a new karmic cycle, they open up a new frequency, a new paradigm, a new life view and vision collectively. Now when this happens, when Saturn and Jupiter meet in the sky once every 20 years, that represents the end of one cycle and the beginning of a new one. So that also involves karma, where we have to have a karmic harvest regardless of how that plays out. As in, we simply harvest the consequences of our actions, of our choices, etc. And naturally we start a new cycle with fresh energies, new plans, new seeds of intentions being ready to be planted into the universe. And the food to make these grow and blossom is naturally our life experiences that we also harvested. So in a classic version of the judgment card, whenever it pops up, well, it can refer to the power of karma, it can refer to higher forces pulling strings, it can refer to divine timing, it can refer to a fated moment approaching, or that maybe things are not 100% in your hands, but rather it is something divinely orchestrated, where even if you have a choice or a word to say or any kind of influence in what's about to happen or how things are going to be playing out later on, well, that word to say, it belongs to your soul, so not necessarily to your consciousness, not necessarily to your ego, to your human self. So it is always an indication to go within and examine what your inner voice says, examine what your inner judge says. What are you accountable for in your life or in this specific situation? What depends on you and what doesn't? Also, many times it invites us to take a look at the cycles of the past, how they played out, and see what we can do differently, to see how our wisdom and life experience can make our future and our future choices that much better, that much wiser, more diligent, or simply more in tune with our own inner truth. In reverse position, or the more unfavorable nuances of this card, might simply represent that maybe we're hurrying a little bit, maybe we're way ahead of divine timing, maybe our inner forces awakened us and we acted way too intensely, way too soon, or quite the contrary, we're not caught up with our own karma, and this doesn't necessarily have to mean anything negative. Sometimes we have to be open to harvest, to good things to come to us, to good things to happen to us. We have to be open towards receiving in order for, good karma to enter in our lives and give us what we need, what we desire, what we worked for. Other times, the negative expression of this card invites us to examine our own judgment. Are our standards, is our judgment, is our perception basically fair, correct, equitable, or is it just one-sided? Are we living in double standards where we might excuse something when it comes to the self and be totally intolerant, for example, when it comes to other people? Or vice versa, are we being people pleasers and excusing certain gestures or whatever that come from others, where if we would be the ones performing them, we would have no excuse for ourselves? So this can also be an invitation to fairness, balance, equilibrium, equity. Or other times the rather unfavorable expression of this card may refer to a principle, a dogma, a religious truth or ideology being perceived way too rigidly by us, and that might limit us. Like a very common example, if we believe that money can hurt us, well then that obviously creates a blockage and we won't be as prosperous as we could be because we fear it, so we kind of reject it unconsciously. Now the modern version of this card considers the Judgment to be the astrological correspondent of the planet Pluto, and that already says a lot of things. Because Pluto, on one hand, is also always a fated energy. Because life basically is never static. We're always evolving, we're always flowing, we're always in emotion, so to speak. So that always means that we have to transform and alchemize all of what we have in the present. So we are constantly morphing, we are constantly changing, we are constantly evolving. So basically every single choice that we make is actually susceptible to the symbolism of the Judgment card, because choice involves judging something, and our judgment are based on our life views, on our driving principles, or on our goals. And this is how our inner truth basically guides everything in our lives, even those things which we are not aware of, even those things which we don't actually care about, but still the driving force is still our own judgment, our own choices. Sometimes these are hidden in the unconscious, but that very special moment when it surfaces and emerges from the unconscious, becoming conscious, that is already a judgment moment, because something dormant becomes alive, and maybe something which was very alive until that moment becomes dormant or just a memory. So this is the symbolism of, death and resurrection, and Pluto is both. Pluto is the planet of death naturally, ruling Scorpio, so the death card. But Pluto is also resurrection, regeneration, the revival of something maybe fated. Another important symbolism of Pluto is honesty, the truth, especially with the self. Truth is power. Pluto is all about power, and we can only have power over ourselves, over our own beings, when we stand from a place of total honesty. Even if we want to transform it, manipulate it, turn it into something else, well, we cannot do that unless we know what it is in its true and authentic version, and that involves being totally honest with ourselves. We cannot heal a pain, we cannot heal a trauma unless we acknowledge it, and unless we are truthful with the self, how much it hurt us, how much it mattered to us, even if all of that is a mistake, even if that is a flaw, even if that is oversensibility. We still need to admit to ourselves that this is how we are, and it matters to us even if it shouldn't, and everything begins from there. Sometimes we can ignore the truth, sometimes we can just turn our eyes away from it. But this is where the fated energy comes into play, because Pluto is fate. Whenever Pluto calls on us, it calls on our souls, then that is always a moment of honesty. That is always a moment of truth, when we have a window of opportunity to stare the Maya, the illusion, the lie, the deception straight in its eyes and see it for what it is. And it is exactly in those moments when we embody our higher selves, the divine from within us. And the divine from within us is at least quantumly connected to the outer divine. So there we have once again the symbolism of divine timing, divine intervention, karma, fated events. Just as in this modern take, it is much more like a parapsychological energy, an inner force, not necessarily an outer force. For example, if we want to change our destinies, if we want to change our fate, if we want a different outcome, if we want a totally different life story, it is within our power to do just that, but we need to transform ourselves in order to become a match to whatever it is that we want to experience. So again, the Judgment is a very strong alchemical card, but also a fated card, because whenever we want to change fate, well, then we have to face the trials, we have to meet the expectations, and most importantly, we have to deem ourselves worthy. So the judgment of the self from the self. This is where we are ultimate judges for everything good or bad that happens in our lives. It doesn't matter what action we take. If for us personally, if for our souls, our divine self, that is justified, that is fair, equal, well, then we are never going to feel guilty for it. We are never going to regret it. That will be part of our own personal truth. Of course, some of these actions might leave the universe in imbalance. So basically meaning that we did a bad thing, or karma will definitely return back to us. But in whichever way karma returns back to us, we'll never see the consequences as something devastating, negative. We are not going to stand from the position of the victim, because if our souls don't regret it, if we accept that our action was perfectly equitable and driven by divine forces, well then regardless of what our action was, we were part of the divine plan, we were part of the divine scheme. So we are absolutely okay with everything. But of course, this is perfectly true the other way around. It doesn't matter if something is fated. Even if the universe delivers something to you on a silver tray and asks you to do it, if inside of you, you judge yourself unworthy, if you judge that whatever that is simply doesn't resonate with you, then the universe cannot force you to embrace that destiny. Even if, let's say, your wisdom does convince you to follow that course of action, the path the universe inspires you to take, well, you can still end up regretting it. You can still end up feeling a certain kind of mistrust. So that is exactly why the answers lie always deep within ourselves. We have to figure out who it is that we are, what are we doing here, what are our heart level, most sacred principles and values in life. Because in order for us to discover ourselves in the most authentic way, we have to strip back all the conditioning, all the education, everything that we learned from others, even our survival instincts and our survival mentality. And that means that we have to be the most innocent but also vulnerable self in order for that mirror image to be as authentic and valid as possible. So many times life puts us in situations where we are totally powerless, where our survival instincts, our animal self, symbolically speaking, cannot help anymore, cannot intervene and interfere anymore. And the choices that we do make out of that position of total innocence and vulnerability is a valid reflection of who we truly are at the core level. And since the universe works in symmetry, the opposite of this is also extremely true. Other times in life, the universe actually, let's say, tests us by giving us excessive power, by giving us absolute control, freedom of choice, and the power to go with it. And what it is that we do, which action we take, what we judge and decide when we're full of power, that is also a valid reflection of who it is that we are, of our inner discipline, and how well can we embody our most sacred principles when life is extremely easy, when the universe just fills us with power, strength, and influence. And it is also at times like these ones when an unwise choice, when a selfish choice maybe, or when a silly, foolish course of action becomes a very, very important core life lesson, exactly because we judge ourselves. In a moment when we have all the power and we decided to use it in a selfish or a way which doesn't really reflect who we truly are, well then of course self-guilt comes into play. And forgiveness for the self, is a really hard and complicated process, because we have to prove to ourselves so very many times and on numerous occasions that we are different, that we have learned, that one single mistake or bad choice in the past doesn't define who we are, that we will also need a lot of patience with ourselves for us to prove time and time again that we are different. And when we reach self-forgiveness, well then it stops, the lesson stops, the lesson is already learned and embodied, so there is no reason for fate and karma to tempt us anymore. This is the moment when Pluto becomes our power and we find ourselves already profoundly transformed by our experiences, our karmic moments. One of the more unfavorable expression of the Judgment card, even in its modern interpretation, well, it can be us judging something about ourselves or the self or a situation way too roughly, without a perfectly open mind, open heart, or with a lot of unconscious influence which we have to discover. Like, for example, you meet a person and you just don't like them from the first second, and you don't exactly know why, because let's say it's not intuition telling you that there is something suspicious about this person. It is just a repulsion without any real explanation from the start. So as I said, it's not intuitive, it's not a warning sign. And in order for you to discover why you simply don't like this person, why this person repulses you, you have to go within and play with certain inner symbols of, for example, what and who this person reminds you of, or why it is all the small little reasons why you would feel this way. And often we find ourselves that what it is that we don't like in a specific person for no reason is because they reflect something that we don't like in the self. So it is just a projection of our own judgment. Now in the following, let's take a look at what the Judgment card can represent combined with other cards? Well, first of all, it is absolutely obvious that it is all about some kind of judgment, as in you having to decide what something means for you personally, or maybe form an opinion, form a preference, etc. This especially in the most practical senses, when the nature of the question or the subject is not really susceptible to big philosophies, to spirituality, when it is something extremely practical and straightforward. Like, let's just say, will I get this job before you go on an interview? And the Judgment card and the Three of Coins pops up, and then it's very obvious that you have all the chances to get this job, but first go on the interview and see what you think about the company, about the job itself, etc. And after you leave the interview, then you already answered this question for yourself. Also, sometimes when your question is answered through the Judgment reversed, regardless of what cards follow next, many times it doesn't actually mean anything, but the tarot or whatever you're channeling telling you that your question is not really viable, or your question is not logical, ask in a different way, or basically gather your thoughts and figure out another approach to this question, subject, whatever it is, because the answer is not going to be obvious, it is not going to be logical or rational or precise or correct, because basically the way you put the question or way you think about the subject will have a flawed logic to it. You know, as they say, silly questions naturally are answered with silly answers. Other times, the Judgment reversed with, for example, the High Priestess reversed, or High Priestess, the Magician reversed, the Ace of Swords or the Swords court cards reversed, might indicate that the universe may not answer your question. Or you receiving this kind of information would be against your greatest good. So very many times it can be an indication that the divine forces are not answering that specific question, or there is a secret which is not yet ready to be revealed to you. Other times, quite the contrary, the Judgment card with, for example, High Priestess, or let's say Magician, Eight of Coins, Ace of Swords, even Four of Cups, indicates that you already know, or that you are perceiving things in a logical and rational manner, and you can simply create the scenario in your mind and you'll have the answer there. Or that you are going to find out the answer to your question very soon anyway, so just live it. As I said earlier, in both versions of interpretation of this card, both the modern and the classic, it still represents a fated karmic energy. So it kind of indicates that one way or another, either internally or externally, the divine is at work. So sometimes it just indicates that whatever the nature of your question was, or your spread or your guidance, it tells you that it is part of your fate, part of your karma, you're part of the divine scheme. So it can reflect that whatever that situation is, well, it is very important, because it can, the outcome or the specifics can influence someone's fate. Other times this card speaks about manifestation, someone's perhaps desires, someone's spiritual work, prayers, or whatever they were focusing on can manifest and alter the course of things. Usually when things will take a totally different turn and might not really follow the logical course, the logical path, because of divine forces, divine intervention, a moment of luck or a moment of disaster. Like, for example, the Judgment with the Wheel of Fortune, Judgment and the World card, Judgment and the Empress card, for example. Well, it can represent good fortune, it can represent Judgment and High Priest help coming from a really influential person, it can represent divine intervention, the universe delivering something to you on a silver tray. It can represent good karma. It can represent karmic harvest. It can also represent something from the distant past which was not settled, returning into your life as a surprise, as a delight. Judgment and Ten of Coins can also represent an inheritance of some sort. Judgment and Six of Coins can be like a massive donation, a gift, a gesture of important help coming from the universe. So the person who the universe chooses to embody this can be anyone. But it's usually someone who owes you something, either because of an agreement or a karmic contract. Judgment and Justice cards. This can mean either divine justice, as in it doesn't matter what the situation seems like right now, justice, equilibrium, divine fairness has to reshape, reconfigure things, or you are given the chance, the opportunity to be part of divine justice. Sometimes it can also mean divine injustice, but all of those cases is basically the universe telling you whatever happens next is gonna seem very unfair to you personally, but don't panic, don't judge, don't rage, because the divine plan will also turn it around at the right time. Many times the judgment, actually in a negative position of course, actually tells you don't judge it, don't allow it to affect you in a very negative way, don't dwell on it, don't fear, don't panic, because it is meant to play out in this specific manner. Other times it can also represent where the karmic forces are leading you, and I would like to focus more on the negative aspects, because whenever this card pops up, the Judgment, the negative isn't really negative, it is just an appearance. Like, for example, a Judgment reversed and Ten of Swords. It means that, yes, there is a moment of surrender, a moment of defeat, a moment which lacks success or breakthrough, but something totally new and much better will take its place or offer you something much better than what you are losing or giving up on. Also, sometimes the Judgment and the Ten of Swords reversed can mean that even if the situation does seem right now as total defeat, no possible salvation, no options, no way out, just wait, because it will turn around almost miraculously, so it's not over yet. And also sometimes when the Judgment is combined with a really predominantly negative card, let's say for example, Three of Swords, Nine of Swords, Five of Cups, Five of Coins, Seven of Coins reversed, etc. Well, it can tell you that you are the one creating the problems in your life. Like, for example, Nine of Swords. Somehow it is your inner choice to be this depressed or anxious or worried, sleepless nights, all of that. For some reason it is just an inner force causing this, and you have to figure out why and how to fix it. Or, for example, Judgment and the Five of Coins. It simply tells you that the material scarcity or illness or poverty is basically kept on in existence. So it is created by either one of your inner blockages or either a judgment of yours, a principle of yours, a faith that you have. Or let's say in other cases, it can simply indicate that something rather negative is going to happen. For example, Judgment and Five of Wands, a fight, a contradiction, a clash, and the Three of Cups with friends, let's say. But it tells you that this fight or this contradiction, this argument, battle, whatever this is gonna lead to harmonizing the friendship that much more. Because when you speak your truth and the other person speaks their truth either, that is already a middle ground where these two even contradictory opinions can meet and harmonize themselves or separate for good. Now, last but not least, I would like to close this episode with the advice I give so very many times in order to best understand the symbolism of this card and what it means to you personally and how the universe is communicating with you through this card. The best idea is to just experiment, do different spreads, and wait and see how things turn out, so that the symbolism of this card basically crystallizes within your intuitive senses. Especially that this is one of those cards which has so very many different takes on it. Well, this concludes today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, bye for now.